Hello, everyone. Really good to see you. I say see you again. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me and my guest today, which is Mike Broadbent. And this is really slightly different because I had never heard of well, I might have heard of psychodynamic counselling, but I had no idea what it was until I had a long chat with Mike to understand it. And I just think it sounds really interesting, and I can see that it can, although it's definitely one of the lesser known counselling techniques, as I understand it, I think it's definitely something that is worth having a look into and of value to so many people, which is obviously what you're going to discuss with us today, Mike.
Yes, indeed. Yes, pleased to be here.
So as usual, please feel free to post questions as we go along chatting, and then at the end of the session we'll do our usual roundup of questions. And I do have Mike some questions that have been posted in previously, which we'll get to. And I have to say that I did find, because we always do those Talkhouse Meets the Experts, and I have to say that your one was very interesting. In fact, I'd almost like to run the webinar on your Talkhouse Meets questions, because that was really, really interesting. Hear about it. But before we talk about psychodynamic, well, I don't know whether it's best to explain what psychodynamic counselling is, or we explain some of your background and why you got into it, and specifically why this counselling. I don't know, whichever you think is best.
Well, it's probably best just to give a brief introduction to what psychodynamic counselling is, because people may be wondering. So it's a form of counselling that gets to the root of the issue. That's what it's designed to do. It works with the unconscious. So people probably have heard of the subconscious. Well, in psychodynamic, we use that and get into what's under the surface, and particularly going back to root causes of people's issues, which often stem from childhood experiences, perhaps adverse experiences with parents or school or whatever. It tends to be held once a week. That's the normal thing for 50 minutes. It tends to be the client doing most of the talking, and the therapist would mainly listen, but they make interjections every now and then and prompt the client perhaps to say a little bit more about something, or to get in touch with some emotions, or maybe make a link back to something that may have happened in childhood. It can be fairly short term, a few weeks, or it can go on for quite a long period of time. It can go on for several years. Just quickly, in terms of it being one of the lesser known one, I suppose most people have heard of CBT through the NHS, which tends to be short-term 6 sessions, which is a particular way of working where the counsellor will direct things and give the client homework and things like that. So I think psychodynamic would be one of the more common ones that isn't CBT. So you may have psychodynamic, you may have a person-centred or humanistic, or sometimes integrative as well. But it's quite a mainstream one, and it is actually the one that comes from, it stems all the way back to Sigmund Freud and the early psychoanalysis stuff, so it's got a long heritage going back a long way.
And so what made you, because I know your background isn't from healthcare professional's perspective or a counselling, so do you want to explain a bit of your background and why you ended up doing what you do?
Yeah, so I started off I did an engineering degree, and I was in electronic engineering for a long time. In my teenage years, I did do kind of a little bit of informal counselling, because I run a youth club, and there were, some of the kids who had all sorts of issues, and they used to come to me, and I used to sit with them quietly and talk to them. So I quite enjoyed doing that and found it very rewarding to help them. But then I went quite away from that through my career in engineering. And then I eventually moved into change management and training. And one of the things that attracted me to the change management side of things was how much I'd seen people suffering, I suppose, in industry through changes that were imposed upon them without adequately preparing them for it. And it has quite a disturbing effect. And I wanted to get involved with something that would help people through those change processes. And in doing so, while working with you, Katrina, was working with groups of people who were going through those change and interviewing them on a one-to-one basis. And some of them have been there quite a long time, some of them were quite young, and listening to their stories and what was concerning them. And again, that was almost like a well, it was like one-to-one counselling sessions in some respects. Then I heard about neuro-linguistic programming. It's called NLP. Some of you may have come across it, which is a particular form of therapy, and sometimes it involves hypnosis. People have often heard of it in terms of a sports setting where sports coaches will use NLP to train up sportsmen, but it's also a therapy style. So I trained up in that, and then I found that was some really good stuff in there, but I felt I needed more training and to go through perhaps a more recognised and formal training route. And that's when I decided to go through the counselling training program, which takes quite a while to get from start to the accreditation. That's something like 6 or 7 years overall. And I started doing the lower level courses, and I first started thinking, well, this modality was good, or this approach. And then I realised that psychodynamic was the one that appealed to me. I think because it has such a long heritage, because it actually appealed to my style of working, I could agree with the ideas in there that people's problems tend to be linked back to childhood, and I like the whole idea of exploring that with people. So I decided to follow the psychodynamic route, and then came through and followed it through to accreditation.
And I do think having, the background and understanding your path to it sort of definitely makes sense as to why you're doing it. And I do feel with a lot of professions, it's really good to go and have real life experience rather than just training to be a counsellor if you've had no experience in the workplace or in other areas, because it does allow you to understand and be, I feel, to be more empathetic towards people in understanding because you've been there yourself, you've been through those changes and all of those.
Yeah, I think that's very true, actually. I personally feel that the more life experience you've had yourself, the more you're able to empathise with all sorts of different issues that the client has. That's not to say that some young counsellors can't be very good counsellors as well, but different people prefer different things. So, a younger person might prefer a younger counsellor.
Yes, I think so. And also things are slightly different, aren't they? Things have changed so much because lots of people, we now know, I mean, if you've been counselling for a little while ago, you wouldn't have had all the social media concerns and issues that people have. So if you're a younger counsellor, you get that. You understand how invasive that is on your life. Whereas an older person, you don't have those pressures necessarily because I think we're one step removed just because we weren't brought up with it. So
interesting you bring that topic up, because I think that's having an enormous impact on people, the whole impact of social media, and particularly what we've just been, or we're still going through with the COVID thing, is having a huge impact on mental health, and they're not just younger people, older people as well.
And talking about that COVID word, which is, we try not to talk about it so much, but have you noticed a difference, or have you noticed if you've got more people, more inquiries over the last, 14, 15 months?
I haven't personally noticed a high level of inquiries. I think the thing is, there's two conflicting things here. So one is more people are needing it, but then there's fewer people who are perhaps able to afford it because their jobs are under threat, or they're in furlough, or they're not earning as much money. So I think it's there's those two factors, which I think probably it may have remained level, even though the mental health problems are undoubtedly growing.
But it will be interesting, isn't it? Because we're still in the middle of it. We haven't had the after effect and the aftershocks. I mean, obviously, some people very sadly are obviously now very much living with long COVID, and some of those have been living with it for a good 12 months now, realising the impact. But it will be interesting. Interesting, and it sounds like in a morbid way, and I don't mean it, but what that long-term impact is, because they're saying, especially with psychodynamic, is all about childhood issues and concerns. That is what is going to be the long-term effect of COVID, of what those, the 12 months of, not having the social contact. That is obviously very, very important for informative years as a young person as you're growing up. That's
absolutely true. I mean, maybe it's a chance to just bring in some of what's called the developmental theory which underpins psychodynamic. So it very much puts a strong emphasis on those very early years, going right back to when you're a baby, because during that, say, the first year, you're learning how to interact with others, And within that, they get a lot from the face of the person they're interacting with. I heard from someone today who said that, in fact, it was a GP, who said that they have a baby and the baby doesn't respond to them until they take their mask off and smile at them. So even going right back to that stage, if they're seeing people with masks on, they're not able to interact with them and learn properly. And that's such an important stage of life. But how the mother interacts with the child is really important. So the mother needs to give that protective, nurturing environment. Now, if the mother's suffering, which the mother would likely to be suffering in this as well, and very worried about things, they're perhaps not able to give the right attention to the child at the right time. I'm not saying it's going to be a disaster for the child, but it's going to affect the way they develop and they're able to interact with others. There's a part of psychodynamics called attachment theory, which is very much looks at those early years and identifies particular attachment patterns that people develop as they go through life. So some people tend to be avoidant of contact with people because that's the way they were treated. And some people some people are over needy of attention all the time. Again, that goes right back to those very early years.
I'm sure there must be some studies that are starting to be commissioned to understand the psychological impact over the various age groups of children. And I mean, it would be interesting because it will be different ages react differently.
Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those young kids, it's sort of set in stone in terms of, they're like little sponges at those early days, and they just absorb things without really understanding what they're learning. They're just learning like animals do. It's like behavioural training that become conditioned to respond in certain ways. So that's sort of plugged into them. But then, yes, you go to the sort of teenage years being knocked away from their friends and not able to go out. And then there's the fear associated with the disease itself, and that has a very debilitating effect.
Totally.
And some older people as well, that's perhaps where it kicks in, that A, they're isolated, and B, they can be absolutely terrified of going out. It's not a healthy state to be in. So you're right, it does affect people across the age range in very different ways.
Yes, and I think also a lot of the mixed messages and the messaging we're having isn't helping people or putting stuff into perspective. And I don't think anyone is ever trying to undermine how serious it is, and we should all be cautious. But there is also other things that we need to consider. But moving on, let's get away from COVID. Is how so? I've heard about. So I could say, well, I've heard about psychodynamic. Don't really know what it is. But is there an ideal person to have it? Would you say there's a sort of somebody who's got some health concerns, mental health concerns? They're not sure. Maybe they're just feeling that something's not right. They can't work out whether it's their current circumstances or maybe something they have crossed their mind at something in their past that could be affecting how to move forward. Is that the ideal candidate for psychodynamic?
Yeah, well, let's start by saying people who perhaps wouldn't be ideal for psychodynamic, and that's people who perhaps have a symptom like a phobia or something, and they want a short-term fix for it. So they want to go to someone 2 or 3 sessions, 3 or 4 weeks, something like that, and they want to have that symptom fixed. I mean, that's something that's better suited to something like CBT. The person who comes to psychodynamic is someone who's who has obviously a problem that's serious enough for them to want to spend money and time on it, and that's a commitment that needs to be made. So you've got to be serious enough to want to do something. But then someone who's interested to understand themselves and discover things about themselves, and in some ways have the courage to step into some difficult places. Sometimes going back to childhood experiences can be quite difficult for people to come to terms with. They're locked it away in a cupboard, repressed it, as the technical term is, and to suddenly bring that out into the open can be quite painful to deal with, and that's where you need all the training to become a counsellor to be able to deal with that. So someone who's got an issue that's reasonably serious, who is able to commit the time and the money, who's interested in finding out about themselves and hearing a different perspective. That's probably about it, really.
The 2 things that cross my mind is, one, you mentioned money, because it's something that we never talk about, money, particularly in healthcare, because we always think we've got it for free. I mean, is it something that you can get on the NHS? I mean, are doctors prescribing it as such?
Well, psychodynamic is an approved therapy under the NHS. I think the thing is there is a reluctance to put people on anything longer than about 6 weeks. The preference seems to be 6 week CBT therapies, and 6 weeks is really not long enough for a real psychodynamic work. You can make some progress then, but normally it takes a while to establish a relationship. And if there's some deep stuff the client wants to get into over time, it takes a while to get in touch with that and to work through it. And the NHS seems reluctant to spend the money on that longer term therapy. That's not to say you can't get it. And to be honest, I'm not, I haven't been close to the NHS side, so I tend to work privately. I'm not sure how difficult it is to get. I think it is quite difficult to get that longer term stuff. Another way into it is through employee assistance programs. So they will fund longer, well, depending on the insurance company. Again, some of them prefer to go for the short-term stuff, 4 to 6 weeks, but some of them will fund longer-term work as well. So there are those other routes into it, and then there are some low-cost agencies as well that will, see clients for as little as they're able to afford. But in the main, in private practice, the fees range anything from sort of £40 to £50 up to over £100. But typically maybe 50, 60 locally around here. If you go into London, it tends to be 10 or £20 more expensive, probably £70 in London, £80.
And then, it is important, isn't it, to discuss the practical side of these things, and especially if you're going to embark on it. And I think that you've been very honest in saying, well, it's not a quick fix, it's not a 4 to 6 weeks thing, because which would be quite nice to explain this business of when you go to see a counsellor, is the fact is that it does take a while. It's like building a friendship. Somebody isn't instantly a friend. You don't have that immediate rapport. And likewise, why would you be revealing some deeper things which it's hard enough to reveal to yourself, let alone someone else, within a matter of 3 weeks? Just 15 minutes.
Yeah, and also if you look at it, say you're 40 years old, there's 40 years of life following a particular pattern or a set of repeating patterns, because repeating patterns is another thing we tend to look for in psychodynamics. 40 years of living in a particular way, and to suddenly expect to change that in a few short weeks is expecting a lot, particularly if you're looking at some major things like how you relate to people, what your relationships are, how you relate to your managers at work, how anxious you are when you go out and meet people. These are kind of big issues that people tend to have lived with over their lifetime. They go, sometimes they're a bit worse, sometimes they're a bit better. So to expect to deal with that in a few weeks is a tall order, I think.
So I've got some anxieties. I think they're from my past, but I can't pinpoint it. Is that what you help people to do? Is try to pinpoint where that anxiety or concern started? Well,
the aim, obviously, we need to keep focused on the primary aim, which is to relieve the anxiety, and sometimes it means going right back to the cause. Sometimes it can be dealt with just by talking through things more in current life. But in psychodynamic, generally it will have come from the past somewhere. Right. So I don't tend to go back to that. Just identifying the cause itself is not necessarily enough to resolve it. But what's more important is kind of like reconditioning the brain really to not be anxious. Yeah. And in psychodynamic, that kind of means going back and revisiting the past and to a degree going back into it and feeling the feelings that you might have felt at the time and experiencing those feelings with another person and working them through and kind of getting rid of them. So there's the feeling element to it as well as the understanding what went on, and both of those things together generally result in relieving of those symptoms of anxiety, and people gain more confidence, they're more able to fulfill their potential in life, really.
I could see that for people that potentially it could be very frightening experience is to something that you've blocked off that you don't examine and talk about, but it's just you've got it in a little box, but it's not boxed off enough because it's affecting your day-to-day life or some of your life now. How do you start breaking down the barriers or opening up the doors? How do you slowly coach somebody to feel confident enough to go there, not just with you, but with themselves?
No, that's a good question. I think generally speaking, well, perhaps going back to the process again. So people who come to psychodynamic counselling will have an assessment. I mean, just typically the way I would work is someone contact me via email or something, or leave a message. I'd have an initial conversation with them just to clear up some things about location and pricing and availability, just so we're not wasting anyone's time, and then do an hour and a half assessment. And in the hour and a half assessment, that includes going back and asking some questions about childhood and about childhood relationships with parents and other key events in childhood. So the counsellor will have some of that knowledge as they embark on the counselling. So there'll be little things, little flags and warning signs go off in the counsellor's mind during the assessment. But once you get into it, it tends to be quite client-led. So the client themselves will certainly start talking about their current life situation, the current relationships, the anxieties from day-to-day, worries about work and things like that. And to start with, that will be the main content of the sessions. And people will feel it's quite a relief just to be able to talk to someone in a confidential environment. Another important fact here that these sessions are, I mean, I guess it stands to reason that they're confidential, but they're confidential. So that offers some relief. And then gradually the therapist might bring in or ask the client to perhaps remember a time in childhood when they might have experienced a similar feeling, or maybe bring in something from the assessment and say, well, I remember during your assessment you talked about something like this, and then get them to talk about perhaps some of those experiences in childhood. And it's very much, testing the water from a counsellor perspective, because it's not the counsellor's job to push the client into those places. It's perhaps gently lead them or indicate there might be something there to follow up and open some doors. But essentially it's down to the client to take it at their own pace. And if they don't feel that there's any particular point in going there, then maybe the counsellor leaves it for a while. Maybe come back to it later on when the client is starting to feel a bit more ready to explore that. But some people are quite resistant to the idea that it can be anything to do with childhood, and that's fine. Yeah. Maybe later on they come to realise actually there is some impact and they want to go back into childhood and talk about some of the things that happened and understand what went on.
And with your experience, or in your experience and with your experience, can you see quite often, quite quickly, what the issue is, but the person themselves can't see the problem?
Well, I think that's true. Yeah. But clients are often not ready to know that. And to be honest, I don't know whether that's true or not. I have an intuitive understanding of something that might make sense from the theory, but I don't know whether that's true or not. And it's not necessarily true for that particular client. So I think that it's a very collaborative thing with the client. I can't assume I know anything. It has to be about the client's understanding of it. And if we come to something where perhaps I suggest something, and the client has to feel that that is true for them, has to ring true for them. It's not that I know what's going on, although I might have some idea, and I may be right, but I may be wrong. It's whether the client feels that's of value to them.
Yes, exactly. And also, I suppose the other thing is you having to be open all the time, because it's very easy to close yourself. Well, you could be, if you were a bad counsellor, say, oh, well, I could know what this problem is. But you don't know this person's whole backstory. So there could be some other huge issue that's taking a long time to come out for you to really understand why they are where they are, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So some things do remain hidden from both of you for a while, the counsellor and the client, and they gradually come out. I think the counsellor would have an inkling that there was something there of that nature because of the way the client is living their life and behaving or reacting to things. We wouldn't know necessarily exactly what it was. And to start with, the client may not know either. That would literally be blocked out of memory.
Well, that's interesting, the blocking out of the memory stuff. Now, it'd be nice to go back to that, but just very quickly, where we're talking about the role of the counsellor, which is obviously key. How do you choose which counsellor works for you? How do you know? I mean, there's obviously some standard stuff that one should be looking for, some accreditation. But talk me through how you think one should find a counsellor.
Well, websites like the BACP, which is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, or the Counselling Directory, are both two good sites. And there's other ones out there as well. So basically, I would suggest you go to one of those. I think probably the first thing to look for is the different types of therapies that are available. So there'll be a tab on there, you know, what therapy should I choose or something. So have a look through there, and then you'll read through the descriptions. And what you want to be going on really is whether you instinctively think, oh, well, that feels right for me. That's best, or this, you know, what feels, so I feel actually that gels with the way I think about things, and I could actually go with that. So I think from that you get an idea of which of the types of therapy, you know, approaches you would like. And then once you know that, then you can, so both of those sites have directories of therapists or counsellors. So you can do a search there, and you can search on that particular therapy, whether it's psychodynamic or whatever. And then you put a search for your area and how far you're prepared to travel, and then you'll get a list coming up then. And then you get a photograph, and you'll get a brief introductory statement, and then if you click on it, there's more detail of what they do. And I think, first of all, there's the photograph. So you will see a photograph, and there'll be an instant reaction to the photograph. That looks like someone I could work with. And all sorts of factors then come into that: age, gender, you know, all sorts of things. And then, you know, the first couple of lines of what they write there, does that stand out to you? And then when you go in there and you read their profile, do you feel like there's an affinity between you and that counsellor or not? And I think, to be honest, that's the best thing to go with, because that's, at the end of the day, what you're aiming for is a good therapeutic relationship with your counsellor. But, you know, it's a person-to-person connection that's really the most important thing there. Obviously, there's price and other things as well that you might want to take into account. But, yeah, so I think it's a very subjective thing. And then obviously you would make contact with them, you have an initial conversation, an assessment, and again you're gauging whether you gel with this person or not, and whether you feel you could actually, you feel you could trust them, whether you feel they have the skills necessary to help you. Those are the things that you want to be looking for, I think.
Yes, and at some point you just have to make the leap, don't you, one way or the other. And it could be that you find counselling isn't something for you anyway, but until you try, you don't necessarily know. But I can see for some people it's a massive step to take, and quite frightening.
Oh, absolutely, it is a huge step, yeah. I think the assessment is very helpful. That's something, there's no obligation. I mean, it costs, most counsellors will charge for the assessment. But it does give you a chance to see the person who may become your counsellor, and to get a feel for what it's like, and also the setting itself. So different counsellors work out of different settings. Do you feel comfortable in that particular setting, whatever it is?
Definitely. And I suppose the other thing is, don't be put off by the first person. If you find the first person isn't right, you just feel like saying, I would suggest go and try someone else, because you know, it's a big step to say you feel that you'd like help, because obviously that's what people are coming to you for, and it'd be a shame to shut down straight away. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So I was just looking at I did say that we'll come back to looking at, you know, opening that box. So that's really what we were saying, isn't it? You take it slowly at the clients, and you're obviously going backwards and forwards, testing as to how much they will open up to you. And I think that was the thing that interests me, is that what they remembered. So lots of people do tend to shut stuff off, do they? That they, you know, completely forget about potentially.
Yeah. I mean, people don't tend to remember things, as you know, before the age of 3, 4, 5 anyway, because the main memory systems aren't really active at that point. But so there can be stuff that happens in those early years, which is very important. You know, very early bad experiences, and some of those that you can't necessarily pinpoint specifically, but you can kind of infer what happened then from how people are later on. But if you suffer a severe trauma, you know, something like sexual abuse, for example, that's something that you may well block out of your memory. literally it's just blocked out and you don't remember it. The memory is still there, but it's not accessible to you. And those can be very difficult to access, and when you do access, they can be quite scary for people when those memories start coming back to them. And that's where you need to be very careful with that overall process, making sure that you're safeguarding the overall well-being of the client. It may be that they need to go through and work through that, but you can't destabilise a mother's life or someone who's holding down a job and needs the income. So it needs to be managed very carefully, and that's where the skill of an experienced therapist comes in.
Yes, and I mean that's what we talked about earlier, is the fact is you don't get someone to reveal something that's like, oh my God, earth-shattering, then go, right, time's up, off you go. You don't do that.
No, again, it's the counsellor's responsibility to manage the time within the session, to make sure that by the time you get to the end of the session, the client is ready to go back into the world. So 10 or 15 minutes before the end, if there's been some particularly intense stuff going on, is gradually bring it back. I look at it as like a surgeon, so sewing the client up again, dressing on, ready to go out before, so they can go back to their life again.
And I know it sounds stupid. Would you explain to somebody that's how you work? Or would I, coming to you as a new person to counselling, would I say to you, how do you work? Do people ask that sort of thing? Because what we've just said is, to me, really important, is understanding how I'm going to be looked after in this session. Would you expect a counsellor to mention that at all?
They may mention it right at the beginning, or they may mention it when you start getting into some more sensitive stuff. I think it is certainly something you could bring up right at the beginning and explain. You would explain some of that, not necessarily as much as I've explained there. But I think you're right, that is something that clients need to know, certainly before you get into that work, so they can have the confidence.
I'm just sort of thinking of things to take away from this webinar, or if you're listening to it in the future, for people to consider, well, I am, interested, and these are the sort of checklists. It's like when you go to the doctor, you should write down all your problems before you get in there, because it just disappears once you're in there. And it is important, because if it's a long-term thing, you're spending money on it, and it's you're taking it seriously. So that's important.
I think just one other thing to add in there on that sort of ethical responsibility of the counsellor and their ability. So counsellors, all counsellors certainly registered or accredited with BACP, and I think this goes for most of the counselling agencies, have their own supervision, which has a special meaning in counselling. Basically, it means every counsellor goes to talk with and experience someone who's qualified as a supervisor, which basically is kind of a slightly higher level, or it's a different role actually. Someone they can go to and talk about their cases. They don't mention names, so it's just sort of general, but if there's anything concerning them about the client, or they need a little bit of advice here, or maybe they want to have a separate perspective on it in case perhaps the client's missing something. So that's another extra sort of quality and confidence check for the clients, to know that there is someone behind the counsellor. And then obviously there's the whole of the organisation and the ethical code that counsellors work under, similar to, I suppose, anyone in any of the medical or caring professions. Quite a strict ethical code and insurance, of course. Sorry, we're going to go to another question there.
Well, no, it's just, because when we're getting sort of, once we've gone through, basically asking the questions that I'm interested in, which always worries me, because it's always, it's just looking at what we said we were going to, so I think we've discussed, what do we expect from counselling? I mean, what should I come away at the end of every counselling session with some, do you give homework? Do people have to go and work on things, or?
No, so homework is something that tends to be more of a CBT thing, and people might have things like daily thought records where they write down thoughts at particular moments of the day or when particular events happen. It's not something that psychodynamic counsellors tend to do. And I think part of the reason is that sometimes people who come for counselling they don't necessarily want to do that kind of homework that's set for them, and then they start worrying if they haven't done it, and they go and see the cat, and it kind of disturbs the relationship. So it doesn't really fit so well into the psychodynamic model. But yeah, you're right. People wouldn't necessarily always feel better at the end of a session. I think generally speaking, people do feel better at the end of a session. But if you are getting into some difficult material, difficult areas that they haven't looked at before, then there may be a period of time where actually, that's in the back of their mind all the time, and they're dwelling on it, and they, it does make them feel a little bit more unsettled. But that's a process that you need to go through in order to get to the healing at the end of it. A bit like training for a marathon or something. No, that's a bad example. But you know the idea. Sometimes you will
have some bad days, aren't you? When it's pissing down with rain or something like that, and it's just
and all those things as well. Yeah. I think what you should come out of a session is thinking, well, there's a little bit more enlightenment about what's going on, a little bit more understanding, or I feel a bit closer to some emotion or something like that. I feel there's some progress being made, even though you might feel a little bit worse. I think you should be able to expect something like that from every session, but it can be quite slow progress at times. Then there'll be other times when you have big breakthroughs, and there's a big understanding, a big revelation to you of something which perhaps has been staring you in the face for years, and suddenly it comes to you, and you think, oh my God, why didn't I realise that before? Well, that's why, that type of thing, like a moment of insight. So sometimes those, and sometimes it takes a long while, you're chipping away to get to that point, and suddenly you get those breakthroughs, which can then make quite a big difference as you go through.
And then once again, it falls back onto the expertise of the counsellor, that how you come away, or how you feel after the session, isn't it? You don't want to be coming away feeling but you want to feel that you having to put some work into it.
Yeah.
Do people generally specialise in areas? I know that you do I know you personally do sexual abuse or concerns. Is that because you promote that you do that, or is it just seems to be happening because there's very, very sadly there is so much of it out there, and it's one of those things that is now coming out as people get older?
I think for me, it's difficult to say without going into my own personal background, and I'm not saying there is or isn't anything in there, but often counsellors will specialise according to something that specifically has happened to them, or they just feel drawn into a particular area. I think for me, I was drawn to that because I felt there was so much sexual abuse happened and has happened, and it has such a big impact on people's lives, and I felt it was kind of underrepresented, and there wasn't enough people working in that area. So I think I felt drawn to that area for that reason. But different people, people will often specialise in those areas that they have particular personal experience in. And then it's all very well choosing a specialism, but then you might find that actually you don't get clients come along to you for that thing, whether you advertise it or not. And people are drawn to you for different reasons. And if you look at, the universe, if you like, there's some reason for people choosing a particular counsellor. You kind of have to go with whatever that is, whether you believe in that sort of thing or not. But there's some factors at play in there. Yeah. So I think the thing about specialising, some people will have a very narrow specialism, but I think most counsellors would tend to be fairly broad based.
What is a very common theme that comes up, do you find?
Well, I think relationship problems is probably one of the biggest things. Relating to, particularly partners, I suppose. I think relating to managers at work is quite a big one. I mean, there's general anxiety, general depression, but I think in terms of other particular issues and relationship issues. So one of the ideas in psychodynamic is that you have repeating patterns of relationships. If you look back through your relationships, they tend to follow similar patterns. And if relationships aren't working for you, then there's something wrong with that pattern. And often that can be traced back to sounds a bit cliche, doesn't it? But the relationship with your parent, people have heard of the Oedipus complex, falling in love with your mother and hating your father, that type of thing. But there's a lot of truth in that, actually. How you relate to your parents will, to a large degree, influence how you then relate to others in adult life. So relationships is one thing. And again, the relationships with bosses or people at work can often relate back to the relationship with your dad or your father figure. You tend to relate to them and expect the same sort of things from them. So sometimes working through those issues that you had in childhood with your dad and understanding what that was all about and helps you with a relationship with your boss and your future bosses.
Well, one of the things that you just said that I picked up on and I really like is that you said at the very beginning it is around patterns of behaviour. And I think what you were sort of inferred earlier, I can't remember exactly how you said it, is sorting out the pattern. So it's not you that is wrong, it's the pattern that you are working to that's not right. And I think that's really important, isn't it? It's not generally, and on average, most people are generally nice and they want to be nice and lead good lives. So it's not that person that's the problem, because quite often you always hear somebody say, well, Katrina, what is the common denominator here with all these problems? Yes, it's you. And so it's that onus, isn't it, on it's the person that's wrong, whereas it's not necessarily the person, it's the pattern that they're using.
That's a very good point, actually, yes, because essentially you're repeating a pattern that you were trained to have as a child. If you were brought up in a situation where your dad, it was seen and not heard, and your dad was quite cruel to you, never allowed you to express any emotion, all that sort of thing, it gets conditioned into you through that conditioning process in early life. That will, replay as patterns throughout your life. So, you were blameless when it got programmed into you, and to a degree you've been blameless since. That's not to get away from the fact that everyone does still have choice over what they do, but these patterns tend to kind of force you into particular ways of relating to others.
Yes, and also you can't see it.
Yeah. So the other really important thing you said there was accepting yourself. A lot of counselling is actually about accepting yourself, warts and all. And most people, there are bits of them that they try and pretend they don't really have, all the nasty bits. They pretend they're really nice as pie and all this, and there's all this, another box there with all these dark things. And actually getting people just to acknowledge that everyone's got that sort of stuff and bring it out to the open and be aware of all the bad bits of themselves and the good bits and have it accepted by the counsellor in a non-judgmental way. There's another big thing about counselling. Counsellors are trained, or should be as a person, actually non-judgmental. So whatever you bring to them, they shouldn't really be patting an eyelid and blaming you for this, that or the other, judging you. So you can feel accepted, perhaps for the first time in your life in that counselling thing, and feel more comfortable in your own skin and really get to know who you really are. And there may be some things you still want to change about yourself, but that self-acceptance is a really key.
Yeah, and not to be ashamed, isn't it? Because a lot of people I assume, don't open up because they're ashamed by what they've done, so they hide it away. Whereas, in fact, if you thought about it and examine it and then look at, well, okay, how could I do something differently next time? And that's how you learn, isn't it?
Yeah, shame can be very debilitating. Right. And the things that people are ashamed of are really not that bad at all on a great scale of things. They've been amplified in their own mind to be something absolutely.
Yeah. And then we find that we all do the same things and we all have the same thoughts, and none of us are as original as we might like to think that probably we are. And I think the other thing that you mentioned about is patterns and parents, and how a lot of the ground rules are set by your childhood. But that's, obviously, is because we've got to start at some point, haven't you? You've got to have a blueprint. And I think sometimes that you're taught as a child, you obviously don't know they're even going in, which is what you mentioned earlier. At 3 and 5, you're soaking in without really doing it. If lots of those things are set in concrete. You think there are certain facts that are concrete, and you wouldn't even consider re-looking at them until somebody suggests your reference point may not actually be quite the right reference point.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. Yeah, you can't just take it for granted that that's the way you are, but actually a lot of the way you are, can be changed.
Mm.
There's no really point in changing it if it comes back to your point earlier on, where you've got to a point where there's something about this stuff you've locked away or whatever it is that's causing you a problem. There's no need to change anyone, however quirky they are, unless it's causing them a problem.
Mm.
And I think, once that problem's gone, there may be other things that you might consider that they might work on. There's no point if it's no longer a problem to them.
Mm.
Yeah, if people suddenly realise, well, this way I'm interacting with others is a problem, and yeah, it was set in as a pattern at a very early stage. I assumed that was how I am, but actually there is a possibility to change. I could have a very different life and be quite different in the way I relate to others, for example.
But especially if you don't like the person that you feel that you are.
Yes.
I think, things can change. So before we go on to asking questions and answers, so if anybody would like to post any questions, please feel free to do so now. So how would you, it might be a nice idea, because I know we sort of rambled around the place slightly, is how would you sum up psychodynamic counselling? What is it? What's it very good for? And who would you recommend to seek this type of counselling?
So basically, it's a once-a-week therapy. It's a talking therapy, obviously. It's broadly client-led in terms of the client is empowered to talk about their story in their own way. And the counsellor is there to work with them and to offer some insights and to just steer things occasionally to help the client get to their own truth faster than they would do without the counsellor being there. And that obviously the counsellor is kind of directing them towards those areas where they think the problem, the source of the problem may lie. So psychodynamic counselling very much are getting to the root of the problem and actually looking at a whole person solution, if you like, or the whole person situation. So it's quite holistic in that way, rather than focusing on an individual symptom. It looks at the overall situation. And typically, if there is a specific symptom, the specific symptom is resolved by looking at that overall situation and going back to things that you may not actually think are relevant to the symptom, but they turn out to be actually the cause of it. I think it's for people who are prepared to invest time and to think about things and go to go in to explore some of those difficult things. People who are kind of, I suppose, typically got to a point in their life where they know they've had these issues in the past and it's got particularly bad now, or there's a turning point in their life and they feel they can't, and they say, now's the time to stop this and to really put an end to it once and for all. I'm going to get this sorted out. I'm going to go into therapy or go to counselling, whatever, and get this resolved. It's that kind of attitude, I think, people need to have, rather than, oh, I've got this little problem here, I'm just going to pop along and see if they can fix it. A bit like going to the doctor just expecting a pill for it. I mean, not that that's necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes that works, but that's not what you get with it requires commitment and investment from the client to put into it.
Yeah, and I think I was going to say serious problems. I mean, the littlest problem can be a serious problem to somebody. It's just how you interpret it. But it is for somebody who's really looking to truthfully find out what their issue is and to try and resolve it or manage it, whichever it might be. So yeah, thank you. Right, so
it's a journey of exploration to yourself to resolve your problem. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Right, okay. I will now. Nobody's entered any questions, so maybe we.
I've bamboozled everyone.
So luckily, I have some questions from people before, because as I said, people very kindly send in questions because it's probably easier to write a question when you think about it. I want to try out therapy. Do you have to experience trauma to go to psychodynamic counselling? Does there have to be some momentous?
No. No, it works very well with trauma, but it doesn't have to be something a trauma thing. People can go through what they would describe as a perfectly loving, perfectly normal childhood and still have issues later in life, which actually can be due to what on the surface appear to be quite minor things that might have happened to them in childhood, but turn out to have had quite a big impact. Maybe something like a childhood illness that they had, and the parents supported them through it, but it meant that the kids at school were cruel to them, and that had some effect on them, which caused an underlying feeling of self-hatred or shame or something, which just festered as it's gone through life. So yeah, it doesn't need to be a big trauma. And in fact, you can think actually my childhood was quite fine. But basically, anyone who's got a problem with their current life that they want to resolve.
I think bullying and things like that has a lot to answer for people's, how they go forward in their life, doesn't it?
It does. Well, things like a grandparent dying at a critical age. They can be actually what on the face of it look to be quite trivial things, but to a child, they're really big things. I think everyone probably listening here think back to their childhood and think of something which on the face of it looks very small, but they remember it as vividly because it had some really big emotional impact on them. I can think of, I took my mum was a nurse and she had a little fob watch, and I took her fob watch apart when I was, 7 or something.
Helpful.
And I thought, and then I tried to put it together again, and I couldn't put it back together again. I was traumatised for weeks.
I thought she was going to be traumatised.
It stopped working. So I tried taking it apart to try and put it together to fix. But now I know psychodynamically that might be symbolic of other stuff that's going on, and I do have to know that. But that was a big memory, and I think everyone will have, I imagine, some kind of memory of something that happened to them that was really important to them, but may not have appeared to be important on the face of it.
Exactly. Okay, I've had CBT in the past, but found it wasn't that effective. How does psychodynamic counselling differ, and will it work for me? Well, I suppose it depends on what the person had the problem with, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, I don't want to diss CBT really, but CBT can be effective for certainly coping mechanisms, and it can be effective for some, for some phobias and things like that. And to be fair to CBT as a modality isn't restricted to 6 weeks. It's just that's the way it's implemented in the NHS, and because it's very measurement oriented. You measure the scales at the start, and then you go through, and there's all sorts of tick boxes. It suits the NHS because they can tick boxes and measure 1.2 improvement, etc. So psychodynamic tends not to be like that. So if we've had some CBT and it hasn't been very effective, I think the thing is it probably haven't really got down to the root of the problem, and had a chance to really think about it and explore it, and find something out in one session, and the mind sort of works on something in the background, and there's a new thing pops out in the next session. And I think the fact is it just simply is a slow burn process to really, I believe, to make that really sustainable and fundamental changes that you need to resolve long-term issues.
Well, funny enough, that goes into the next question actually. How long does it take for the counselling to have an effect? Am I likely to see the results? Am I likely to see the results over a longer period of time? Which I think the answer is probably yes.
Yeah, there should be some short-term impacts. Certainly, if someone is really suffering in the short term and they're so anxious or whatever, the focus will be on alleviating some of that quickly, and perhaps introducing some coping mechanisms. So if it's so you get some improvement even quite early on, but the longer you stay with it up to a point, the more the deeper the change and the more fulfilling it becomes, and I guess the more sustainable that change becomes. So it's a progressive thing over a period of time. And some people get through things quite quickly, and other people it takes a long time. It's very different for different people depending on what they're bringing or their type of character, perhaps how much they're able to think about things and understand things and reflect on them versus someone perhaps isn't used to doing any of that. Brought up in a household where emotions were allowed to be expressed or not. But these are all factors that would play into how long it might take.
How long is a piece of a string? Yeah. Last question. Would psychodynamic, I'm going to get used to this word now, counselling, help my current stress-related symptoms, or is it more about past emotional states?
It can do. So psychodynamic doesn't have to go back to childhood. It does incorporate the basic counselling techniques which you would find in something like person-centred or probably any of the other modalities. And those sort of things can help you manage stress anyway. The thing is, the stress simply caused by current circumstances, and often that's perhaps related to not being able to say no to someone because you're taking on too much. And then it might be an explanation, well, why can't you say no? Is there something to do with a self-esteem issue or a fear of losing your job? And sometimes even that might then link back to childhood. So, my dad always put pressure on me to do things, or my dad said, you should never say no to anything, or I always had to be top of the class. So actually, even those underlying factors relating to stress sometimes can link back. But, you start with the present and see what's happening in terms of that stress and whether there's anything obvious that can be done to manage the stress. But I mean, one thing you can say to people, say, well, what you need to do is create a to-do list, for example. To say to people, no, I can't do that, to plan your time a bit better, or to do this and the other. The problem is, if people could do that, then they probably would have done it already, and there's some other reason why the stress is causing them the problem. And that's where you could start exploring back and looking at the underlying causes of it. I don't know if that answers the question. Probably. Anyway.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it does, to be honest, because it's like it's really trying to find out what the stress is. And as you said, it could be something that's quite superficial. But most people would have done the standard things, which you read in a book, which is, do you have a piece of paper by the bed and all of those sorts of things. And if that's not working and you still feel it, and that's why I suppose the importance is being able to speak to somebody face to face, because you can go at any different angle and change. You're not going through some set menu as to what you're meant to be discussing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
But I think another thing, not to be discredited or devalued here, is if you're feeling really stressed and you haven't really got anyone you can talk to about what's going on for you, you know, to just talk to someone about what's going on for you, maybe have a good cry, just get it all out of your system. Often it doesn't feel anywhere near so bad. Simply just talking to someone who's sitting there and their job is to listen to you, and they listen with empathy and understanding, and you really feel heard. That in itself, is the most basic healing part of counselling, without any of the childhood stuff or any of the analysis.
Yeah.
In its own right.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like today's been quite serious, but I just think it's a very serious subject, because it can be absolutely life-changing, I'm sure, for many people to go through this, to unlock some of the concerns that they might have held on for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've got all your details up on the website, so if anyone feels they'd like to have a chat with Mike just to understand a bit more about the process and whether it's right for them or wrong for them, please go and have a look at all the links. That sounds like a sales plug, and it's absolutely, as you know, not a sales plug, but do feel free to get in touch with Mike. And thank you very much for everyone who listened, and see you soon. Thanks, Mike. Bye.